this. Oops. Yeah, I definitely need to add that. There's definitely no way out of that. Okay. This isn't all right. Let's get started. We technically have. We have. Oh. Cool. Double check this. Yeah. Awesome. All right. This is module number 10. We have 3 chapters to go through, and these are actually the last set of 3 chapters that we're going to do. And then after that, we are essentially making our way towards the final. So if you have fallen behind because life happens, hooray, you actually have some weeks to catch up and not feel the penalty of not meeting the due until deadline and having that time to be able to catch up. And if you're all caught up, then you can take the final. And if you've done Splunk before, that'll be a piece of cake and you'll be done with that. So if you're all caught up, it'll be a nice, easy end. If you are not caught up, do not fret. You have plenty of time to catch up. So let's get started with chapter 10. This is really going to be more of Windows Update than anything else. More specifically, the Windows Server Update Services, or WSUS. It's a server role that essentially allows your server to be the update server for your systems. You can handle all your patch management from this one device. So your advantages of using this instead of the Microsoft update is you can control what updates make it. You can reduce internet bandwidth because updates are being downloaded to one and then from there distributed to your local network, which tends to be faster. Only approved updates are installed, which is very important, excuse me, because you determine which patches and updates to apply into your network. Plenty of times we've had Microsoft updates that instead of fixing will create a bigger mess. And by having something like this update service on your network, you can prevent that because you would tell those updates that would crash things to not install and avoid that headache. As you know, it's update is already built in, enabled by default, and no real way to turn it off. You can defer it, but you can't really turn it off anymore. It takes a lot of work to turn off automatic updates. But you can definitely defer and say what hours updates will be active. Restarts happen, and we all know that those suck. It tends to happen at the worst time, right? When you're in a presentation or you're doing something important, and then, updates have to be installed. And by the way, we have to restart. And now you have to wait another 30 minutes for the update to install, and then life can resume, hopefully, without any issues. So you can choose when to run those updates locally. Just like any other role, it's installed into Windows Server. Ideally, it shouldn't be installed on the domain controller. This really should be a different system because updates are actually important. And you don't want the DC to also be your update manager. In one view, you don't want them to be the same because if it gets compromised, not only is your domain compromised, but also your updates allowing an attacker to infiltrate all your other systems through a legitimate service. So by having them split, you minimize that risk. So it has a database, the Windows internal database, which is basically SQL. You can use SQL as well, especially when we're going big and covering multiple systems. Like I said, it should be as a separate server, and it can be installed as a single server solution. You can have multiple servers acting together, and they can act as autonomous or replica mode. So they can either all work alone or work all together. So if we have two sites, let's say, we can replicate from one that we're controlling and send out to the other. Installing it is just like any other role, and you'll see some specific options for this, which are these three: the connectivity, the services, and SQL. So you'll choose which ones you want to add on with this role. You'll choose the location to store all your updates. And then you'll have a management console where you can do everything else. Like where's the upstream server, or where any network settings, any languages, all that kind of stuff. You can do all from there. There's a nice wizard to help you out too. If you have a mixed environment, this update service can handle it. So if you have Windows 8s and 10s, or Server 2016, this update service can handle them all. So configurations that you'll need to do once it's all nice and set up. You'll create groups, and your two defaults are all computers and unassigned computers. So you can make groups, kind of like you can do OUs in the DC. You can make custom groups. You can assign computers into groups either by the update service console or group policy, since it all ties together. Group policy has the capability to manage this. So here you go, enabling the client-side targeting to figure out where the group will go, what system this group will go into, or what group. Once you have your computers in their groups, you can start configuring those updates. Again, this will all link with the OUs and GPO, so this isn't completely separate. It's all part of one big infrastructure, which makes life easier in a way because it's all ties together. Your policy settings in GPO are in here: computer configuration, policies, admin, templates, Windows component, Windows update. And there they are. Now, if you have a specific internet location, that's where you would input it. There it is. So in this example, server DM1 is going to be the place where our desktops workstations, and anything else using this specific policy will get the updates from. How long to wait, what branch to use. After that's all configured in GPO, we can link it to the domain or any other OU. And have all that done through group policy. The synchronization and approval rules is particularly important. This is where you would have some work to do. So after you've configured these systems, putting them in the groups that you want them to belong into, then okay, now how are we going to sync our updates? So we want to do it manually or automatic, and at what time? You could use automatic approval. So when an update shows up from Microsoft, you can choose to have this service automatically approve of an update and send it on its way, or have yourself choose. So you can specify a classification for an update to be approved and what computer. Again, if you are controlling what updates are making it to your system, you at least want to know. And there are some updates that could be fine, that won't really affect anything that you're using, and if it goes south, it can be shrugged off, versus other things that will affect, like the operating system or the kernel, that you might want to double check and make sure it doesn't cause mayhem for you. So right, you have your criteria of the update classification, a specific product, and a deadline. Here are all the classifications. So if there's a driver update, maybe you don't want to manually approve it, and you want to just let it go right away. So you would just say, yes, any driver update, go right away. Any service packs, sure, go ahead, but maybe specific upgrades or update rollups or critical updates we want to check before they go out to the systems. So here's the manual. You can select more than one on your list to approve at once. This can get tedious if you don't, if you're not strategic on what kind of updates do you really want to manually approve versus which ones are perfectly fine. And then after selecting those, you would approve for install. You could also use proxy servers to help you with this. So again, great for communicating with multiple sites. So you would set up the source and proxy server in the settings. You can also download other languages. Pretty much anything you can do from Microsoft Update, you can do in this update service. If you need to change the update file location, you can use the command line to do so. Not so much done from the wizard after it's set up. You can also configure SSL so that the communications on the site, that internal site, are secure. And of course, you can make reports, which will be very useful in seeing overall what things are happening, what updates didn't get installed, creating all that kind of stuff. So here are some of the commands you can use with PowerShell. Windows Defender. Moving on from updates. Well, kind of, sort of, because it does use Windows Update to get its virus definition, is a built-in AV, which it actually kind of surprised at how long it took Microsoft to make their own antivirus. I mean, they're the creators of the OS. They have the best resource to create an antivirus. Most of the AVs out there had to figure out ways around the Windows kernel and set up to create their own. And a lot of them use pretty insecure methods, even to this day, to ensure virus protection. So it's kind of welcome that Microsoft made their own and it works out of the box. So just as with all the other stuff, you can set it up individually or use group policy to configure. Then you'll find the Windows Defender folder among the same place as Windows Update in group policy. Of course, you can set this up with PowerShell. That is not surprising at all. And the update service can obviously handle the update signatures for Windows Defender. So this is something that would probably be a good idea to have as automatic approval. That way those updates get sent out to your workstations right away. Any questions? How are we doing? It's good. Let's good. Let's good. I see no messages in the chat. Okay. And move this over here. Oops. There we go. One down, 2 to go. Okay, server monitoring and backup. A good portion will be spent in monitoring things that you have already seen and interacted with before. So this will be more review. For example, monitoring events. Well, you can live right off the land by using Event Viewer, or you could use a tool like Splunk to manage your logs. I prefer to use Splunk. To me, it works better to search through than this. But if you don't have Splunk, you can live right off the land with Event Viewer. You can create tasks within events to watch for if it happens again. For example, it can display you a message or send you an email and that kind of stuff, which any SIEM can do as well. And the various types of logs that already show up by default and what you can see in them. You can create custom views if you want. You can also forward events if you'd like, using Windows, the forward event log. Outside of logs, you can see what's going on with the task manager, which you have interacted with quite often. You have your process monitoring, your memory monitoring, your disk and network. Again, this is a kind of review. It's the same exact stuff that you'd see in Windows 10, giving you your CPU usage and the chart. Same for memory, same for Ethernet. Now it'll tell you how many users are logged on to your system and any processes that are running on the server. If you have multiple people connected to one box, it can do that for you. Of course, there's services that will tell you what services are running and stopped. You can use the resource monitor to see all these kinds of things as well, which is the much more in-depth version of the task manager. It's all the same as Windows 10, since a lot of it is just shared code, since it's using the same kernel, the same foundation. So the same information you would get out of desktop, you can get out of server. Like in the memory tab, getting what process is using what sections, all of the same things. Your disk usage, all the same things that you would get in desktop, you can also get here, including network and what connections are open, all this kind of stuff. The performance monitor works just the same. There we go. Adding counters to see what's happening and create a chart or information over a sluggish performance. Definitely use performance monitor for that. You can schedule data to get collected. And say how long you want to capture traffic for. Create those performance alerts when something falls below or above a certain threshold, like a disk counter when disk is getting read or written too much, or memory counters, processor, network. So you can keep, by using tools that are already built in, you can create those alerts when certain activity goes out of your baseline. Backing up is pretty similar to the desktop with a couple of changes. There are special services like Active Directory and Hyper-V that are dealt with differently than any other of the services and roles that exist. So of course, you should always have a server backup, even if it's on the cloud. Just because you don't manage the physical infrastructure doesn't mean you should ignore backups. You can add the role feature in the wizard or use PowerShell to install Windows backup. And that's what it'll look like. You can set up permissions as to who can manage backups, who can manage the backups, who can restore files, who can shut down the system. There's already a default group called the backup operators. So a user can be given that role and now they can handle backups. You can do a full backup or a custom, like bare metal, which will do your critical volumes, your system state. That'll hand up the boot files, the Windows system and registry, the system reserved, that system partition that normally is inaccessible, and in the individual volumes. It's always good, a good best practice to have your backups happen when nobody is using the systems or there is the least amount of traffic. And always test them. Don't always assume that your backups work right off the bat. Oh, I see your question. Does Windows Server 2019 still use the Windows 7 backup and restore to make system images that restore with the Windows installer? I'm pretty sure they do. Because it's Windows and they like to just keep reusing stuff over and over. So I don't see why not. Oh, here's that wizard where you would specify the time. You can do those one-time backups as like a quick and dirty. The Windows backup has gotten better, but it's definitely not 100%. You know, it just doesn't beat out things like DD and DC3DD, who capture the entire disk, every bit. You can use volume shadow copy to make full volume backups. These work block by block. And actually, the server backup uses these to create the backup. You can choose what kind of, do you want a normal backup performance, faster, or be custom? VSS admin is the command line program to configure this service. So you can create and delete any shadow copies and list any copies that exist. So if a volume gets corrupted for some reason, you can restore it back with the volume shadow copy. Most roles can be backed up during the usual server backup. There are a few that are going to be a little different. So here are some PowerShell commands for Windows backup. And here's the WB admin. For recovery, the other side, again, you want to test your backups. You want to test that they work. Don't just assume because it says successful that it will be, because like Ciarian just said, when he has tried to do backups on Windows 7, they fail 80% of the time. That's why you want to test. You don't want to make backups and assume that they're good, and then when disaster strikes, then realize that things didn't work. That's just bad news. So regularly test. If you have it shadow copies enabled, regularly test that it works. If you're doing full backups, regularly test that they work. Perform system state recoveries. Do it on like a weekend when no one's there. Again, to ensure that everything is working. Because disaster will happen. It's not an if, it's always a when. You can do a authoritative restore, restoring the Active Directory and the domain controller. A non-authoritative, will have any changes made to the Active Directory objects since the last backup been kept on the server being restored, or you could do the system state, the bare metal, or full server. Now we can choose where we're going to recover a system state of Active Directory. Bare metal, which was mentioned before, is normally used to boot through a medium. So we use like an ISO file, or we use a USB disk, boot off of that, and then use the backup and restore to get our operating system back up and running. from a backup. Now, while most of the services will get backed up and restored automatically, these three are a little more specific. Hyper-V, Active Directory, and IIS. Hyper-V has not only backing up the settings like the switches, configurations, it also has the actual backup of the virtual machines, especially if you don't have something like live migration. So a full server backup or a bare metal recovery of a Hyper-V host will have the role itself, its settings, and the virtual machines that were on it. Whereas a system state will not include the Hyper-V settings or the virtual machines. So when you set up your backup, you have to determine how much space do I have and what am I backing up. The VMs could be running or they could be shut down when this happens, and it'll record including any other snapshots or checkpoints like they call them. And you can use this to restore a VM or the Hyper-V settings back. And again, you want to test. You want to test to make sure that your backups work. We did talk about high availability last week. When talking about Active Directory, the two main folders that are precious to Active Directory are NTDS and sysvol, both located in the system root. They'll have these files. NTDS has these files, and sysvol having the group policy templates, any scripts, and synchronization data. Unless you install Active Directory in a different place, that's where you'll get it. So Active Directory will get backed up during a full backup, a backup of a volume, or a system state. When you need to restore Active Directory, you can do it non-authoritatively, restoring the AD database and allow data to be updated through a replication from another domain controller, or authoritative, where you restore the restored objects are not overwritten by changes from other domain controllers. So if you do authoritative, you're saying this is the Active Directory that needs to get propagated out, versus non-authoritative is here's a backup now, let's update it from somebody else. Right, so non-authoritative can be done when the database is corrupt or when you're doing a full server recovery. Authoritative can be specific. If you do Active Directory as authoritative, then you should also do sysvol authoritatively as well. Does it have an option? Does Active Directory backup have an option like Windows 10 file history where it makes a snapshot anytime something changes? You could do that to the files themselves, but Active Directory is a little finicky. So if you do a file history backup, be careful. The Active Directory is kind of sensitive, like Windows Registry, where if you make a false move, it'll crash. So if you need to back up or repair Active Directory, there is the option within the system configuration. If the recycle bin is on, you can restore deleted objects. But remember that the recycle bin in Active Directory is not enabled by default. And if you do enable it, the only way to turn it off afterwards is to redo all of Active Directory. Just kind of weird. Lastly, there's IIS, your web and application server role. If you want to back up the configuration files, it's all in inetserv, and you can use the app CMD to do so. Otherwise, if you have dynamic content, you would use a backup program to store that. So here's an example of using the app command to make a backup. And it'll be stored in that same folder, in that new folder called backup. So it's a weird backup because it's not really saving in a different folder or a different drive. It's still saving within itself. So this isn't necessarily useful if the drive dies. Now, this is where having a full backup would be useful, because if the drive itself goes bad, your data is still saved. But if you don't rely on that and you just use this backup, you're gonna have some problems. Good questions. Good questions. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily trust the Windows file snapshot thing for Active Directory. Lastly, we have, Lastly, we have Nano Server and Windows containers. Windows container is exactly what you're thinking. It is Docker. Nano Server, used for your small little deployments like a Hyper-V container host, a web server, a DNS server, something tiny. They have no traditional user interface. It's very straightforward because it's Nano. It's supposed to do one little thing. It'll have only the roles, features, services, and drivers needed to do the task. So it'll have low resource utilization. And it has higher security because it has very few services and drivers running. Installing Nano is not an option like you would with like Server Core. It's actually a virtual disk. And you can install certain roles while it's running. So just like Server Core, it needs some default stuff. But the Nano servers will use less than this. You will need the installation media so that it can generate these Nano servers. And you can kind of save that information on your drive to create later. And then you can do something like import module to create images. That'll turn into these little Nano servers. So here we're making a new Nano server image. It'll be a guest edition data center. That's where we want the the file to be created, and its name. So it'll come with a couple of parameters that you'll need to provide. And then we can set things like the deployment type, any drivers, the Hyper-V role if we need it. You can install Nano Server on a physical computer and have things like dual boot, Pixie, or WinPE. Any advanced roles you can add are these: storage, compute, defender, cluster, containers, and packages. Why would you install Nano Server on hardware and not just use Hyper-V in a Nano? Well, if you have a small system and you want it to do a specific job, then you could use Nano Server. So if you have let's say you need a DNS server, but you have a desktop around and your other servers are doing other things, well, you could pop it up easily as a Nano Server. It's small enough that it can run on, even old systems. It's versatile because it's so small that you don't need to install even Hyper-V. Because with Hyper-V, you need virtualization. With Nano, you don't. It's basically like I don't know if I would say it's the Linux of the Windows-only world. I'd say it's more of the it's like getting a very minimal install. Yeah, like Alpine Linux, something really minimal. It's a minimal Windows, even more minimal than Server Core. Here you go, some PowerShells. More PowerShell. So for example, we can install a Nano Server with SCVMM and the compute package. We could install a Nano Server to be our file server. We install a Nano Server to be a web server. Command line is old. So as you have noticed in this course, it's all about PowerShell. Now, PowerShell can do a lot more than command prompt could do anyway, which is why we don't really spend any time talking about the command line. Because PowerShell is more like the bash, where you can do anything and everything. Yes. CMD comes from DOS. That's where you found it first. So just like with a lot of other roles in your standard Windows installs, adding a package doesn't do much other than give you the package. You still have to enable the features and configure them. So your work is not done just because you created a Nano server and you installed the feature. Cool. Still have to do configuration like always. Now here we're enabling a DNS server. And we'll have to set this stuff up. So some common configuration parameters that you'll see when working with Nano Server: the deployment type, the edition, the max size, any drivers, admin password, domain path, and blob path. We can configure IP addressing, the subnet mask. So that'll definitely be necessary. You can join a Nano server to a domain, to the same one as the host system or a different domain. It'll be an offline domain where it'll join the domain without having to contact the controller. Normally, you have to be on the network and have it authenticate, and then it'll be part of the network, but Nano can do it without. And you would use the domain name, the dash domain name, to join it. No, but since it's doing it offline, still make sure that it's accessible and that you have the rights to do so. If you have a domain blob, you can do that too. Kind of like file sharing and whatnot. And some more options that you can add in your configuration. So it makes it into one really long string. Like one really long string. You can edit server images after they've been made. Not everything can get changed after the fact. Like these 4 cannot be changed afterwards. But you can update them as needed. Now, this last section is about containers. And it is definitely talking about Docker. I will say right off the bat, Docker can be a monster to use. It can also be a very big security threat because most people don't check the Docker image that they download before they run it. And it is very easy for attackers to take a legitimate Docker image, inject malicious code, and have an easy backdoor that nobody checked. So when using containers from a public place like Docker Hub, please make sure that you test. Please make sure that you verify, because it is very easy for an attacker to gain access through containers because they're normally not checked. So a container is a software environment that is isolated, but is still part of the OS that it's running from. It is, in a way, self-contained, but it's also part of the host. Like the Nano server, they're very small. They can be used to do a certain task. Easy to be built up and brought down. Kubernetes uses containers to quickly spin up VMs to handle a large load of traffic, for example, of browsing traffic. That's how big sites like Google and Amazon and whatnot they can handle, because they have multiple servers to take those requests. So yeah, when you want something for a fast deployment without worrying about dependencies, has several lightweight components, load management, that's where Dockers can come in just fine. You can deploy containers on anything that has server experience, the core and Nano. With any of them all, you'll need to install Docker. You can use Server Manager to install containers on desktop experience. And you can use PowerShell to do so. You can use Hyper-V as well to manage them if you have the role. Then you would install Docker to your system. And you'll know it's installed when you see Docker-D running. Then you can install a base OS for the Docker client. And then make server containers. I have not had much success running Docker in Windows. I've had a lot of issues. Anyone here have a better experience with Windows and Docker? Yeah, I tend to just use it within Linux. Not so much in Windows. I tried it like once or twice and just got frustrated that it wasn't working right. But it can be done. You can create Hyper-V containers, and this is something I haven't done. Okay, yeah, use Windows with Docker sometimes, but only with Linux-based images, not Windows, yeah. You can also implement containers on Nano. You would just specify the containers parameter or add it after the fact. Once the feature is installed, then you can install a Docker on Nano Server. And then you'll enter that session, and then from there be able to create your Docker containers. There's a number of configurable options in this file that is sitting in this folder that you would have to go into to configure. And here are some tips and tricks with Windows Container. So you have your Docker commands that you typically see on any system. To see the running containers, to stop one, or sorry, to delete, to stop, to start, to get a command line. That's pretty standard across any Docker system. Now you can list them, you can tag them, you can remove, commit changes to images, just like you would do on Linux. It's the same. Giving systems tags. Commit any changes to the container. So any new container will have that new update. And of course, remove. All of Docker uses NAT by default. And you can change the configuration when you create containers. This is also true of doing it anywhere. You can change the default network in the daemon.json file. Normally, you don't need to do this. Oops. Normally, you don't need to do this, but you can. It's really the thing about this is you can go into that file, that JSON file, and change these settings if you so want. You can do port mapping, which again, you can do on any. So if you've ever interacted with Docker, you have these same settings. You can do a transparent network, a layer 2 bridge network as well. That way your container is on the same network as your host. So you're not using that anymore. You're basically bridging. Container volumes just is the same in any system that has Docker. Specify where they are and get to them. The resources you can limit. So if you don't want a specific Docker to have full access to the CPU, you want to give it 5%, 10% or whatever, you can definitely do that. Yep, there are PowerShell commands that work exactly like the Docker. To me, this was more confusing. So Docker exec, for example, the equivalent in PowerShell is this. Commit container image. So I was like, what? Docker run is push container image. Docker pull load container image. Yeah, I guess. But pull container image is Docker push. Yeah, it's a little weird. And got more. I would just use the Docker ones because those are universal. Moving right along. Go on GitHub and you'll find tons of Docker files that you can use to create a Docker image and use Docker build to build them. These are some of the basic commands you'll find within a Docker file. And you say Docker build, and it'll read that file and execute those commands to build out your image. Pretty awesome. Docker Hub is a public repository that you can, anyone with an account can upload. Again, this is what I was talking about, being careful, because it is very easy to for a malicious person to add some stuff and get yourself in trouble. Always test before you download a Docker image. You can also use Azure or Azure, however that is supposed to be pronounced, to get your Docker images and use them up on the cloud. For Docker, I highly suggest this link. Really, to get started on Docker, you can download it yourself. You can also play with Docker in a cloud-based environment, which would be my suggestion. If you've never played with Docker before, definitely do. It's a tech that isn't going away anytime soon. So I would say click play with Docker, create an account if you haven't, and go through the tutorial to learn how to use Docker. It's free and it's good knowledge to have anyway. So I suggest taking some time and just doing the 101. If you have no experience with Docker whatsoever, I suggest get some simple experience that's already provided by the Docker folks. Any questions? Okay. And I'll stop the recording.